This is how to bind a quilt from start to finish. And like I always say, like all things in quilting, there's more than one way to do things. This is just how I like to do it, so let's get into it. I like to use 2.5-inch strips, so I cut out my strip. I needed 4 of these according to my pattern. If you're not following a pattern and unsure how many width of fabric strips you need, check out my video from a few days ago. I have a simple calculation. Also, there are calculators online for this. Once you have all of the strips cut out, you do need to put them together. So I do this by placing one horizontally with the right side of the fabric facing up and then the other one vertically with the right side of the fabric facing down. I am going to be connecting these with a diagonal seam. This helps reduce bulk along the edge of your quilt in the end. So I do think it's worth it to do the diagonal seam versus the vertical seam, though there are some situations where you might want to do that instead. Anyway, there should be 4 90-degree angles at each corner where these 2 strips meet. Draw a diagonal line with a fabric marker from the top left corner down to the bottom right. If you're unsure if you are putting the diagonal line in the right spot, there should be the 2 ends of the binding strip on one side and then the 2 longer pieces of the binding strip on the other side of the diagonal line. Then I like to pin this in place before I take it over to my sewing machine and sew right along that marked line. After stitching these together, this is what it should look like. And then you can go ahead and cut this back so it's at a 1/4-inch seam allowance and then press it open. I do this by finding a small ruler, putting that 1/4-inch line right where my stitch line is, and then trimming off those 2 little ends with my rotary cutter. Make sure you're cutting on the side with the 2 short ends here. Like I said, I like to press this open and then you just keep repeating this process with the end of the binding strip until they are all connected together. Once you have one long strip, you're going to fold it in half with the wrong sides of the fabric together. This means the right side of your fabric should be on the outside and visible. Now you just want to press along the entire length of your binding strip so that it is pressed in half evenly. So I just go all along the entire length and continue pressing. If yours is extra long because you're making a bigger quilt, you can kind of like roll it up so that it stays more neat, or you can even look into getting what is called a binding spool, which is a super fun little tool that you wrap it around. Once that big long strip is pressed in half, it is time to attach it to our quilt. This is where things get different quilter to quilter. I actually like to attach it to the front of my quilt first and then flip it over and then stitch again on the front to secure it to the back, which you will see later on here, but you may find that you like stitching it onto the back first. So just try a few ways, watch a few videos, and decide which will work best for you. So you're going to leave, anywhere from 8 to 12 inches of a tail where you're not going to stitch it on right away, and then pick a side of your quilt, it doesn't matter which side, and start somewhere towards the middle of that edge because we don't want to start off too close to the corner. And you can pin this in place all along the edge, or I just kind of hold it there as I start sewing it on. I really do prefer to use a walking foot at this part of the process because I feel it more evenly feeds the binding on and then it doesn't get uneven at all. That is my personal preference. If you haven't tried it, I do recommend trying it. When you're ready, just start stitching the binding strip onto your quilt. Make sure not to stitch on that tail, leave that hanging. And before you begin here, make sure that the folded part of the binding is on the left or towards the inside of the quilt and the raw edges of the binding strip and the quilt are lined up. Then I just begin sewing along the entire edge with a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and I continue on until I get about a 1/4 inch away from the corner. This is where I'm going to make what is called a mitered corner. Unsure where a 1/4 inch is, just get out a ruler and mark it. Once you get to where that 1/4 inch is from your corner, that is where you're going to want to put your needle down, lift up the foot, and then rotate your quilt so you are sewing off of the edge at like a 45-degree angle. And I do a little back stitch here. Then you will cut your threads and remove the quilt from your machine, and this is what that should look like. Rotate your quilt so that the part you just stitched is on the top, and then fold up your binding strip at a 45-degree angle. When it is folded up at this angle, the edge of the quilt and the edge of the binding strip should match up in a straight line. I like to use a little ruler here to help me fold it back down then at a 90-degree angle, though it's not necessary. So I place my ruler on top here and then fold that piece down at a 90-degree angle so it is square with the corner, and then if you use a ruler, remove it and pin it in place. From here, we are going to start stitching right at the top at that corner and sew all the way way down the edge till we get to the next corner and repeat the same process. Once you've done your fourth corner and you're back on the edge where you started, sew the binding on until you are about to 12 inches away from where you started, and then remove the quilt from the machine, leaving this gap open here. I like to give myself more like 12 inches because it is a little easier to work with that way. Now we need to connect these two binding strips. I am going to be connecting these also with the diagonal seam, so I do this by taking this top strip and folding it back on itself, kind of pick somewhere in between where the two meet towards the middle, and then do the same thing with the bottom strip. You will want the folds to not quite touch, so they should be about 1/8 to 1/4 inch apart. Then I have my iron right here, so I go ahead and give it a good press because I'm going to want to see where these press lines are. If you have a Hera marker nearby, you can try using that too to press a crease. This is the part I used to struggle with the most, so I'll try to go slow here. First, take this top strip and go ahead and open it up with the wrong side of the fabric facing down. It shouldn't be twisted a lot or anything. And we're going to find where these 2 points meet, or where the 2 creases meet. There should be like this X shape. So here I just have it facing up. I'm going to grab a pin and then I'm going to open up my bottom strip, but I'm going to have the wrong side of the fabric facing up or the right side facing down. Then I take the pin and put it right in the spot where these 2 creases meet. Now, whatever's going on with your quilt on the left does not matter. You can bunch it up as much as you want, and then take the pin and put it also in the other strip where the 2 points meet. The 2 strips should be perpendicular, and if you lay them down, you'll see that the creases that are going vertically on one strip will match with the horizontal on the other, and vice versa. A few important things to note here will be that the right sides of the fabric should be facing each other, and then the 2 ends of the strips should be on the right, while the 2 pieces of the strips that meet the quilt should be on the left. Then I kind of just straighten everything out, and then I will actually move this pin and pin it in place. And then you can add another 1 or 2 pins to help you keep it in place. You'll want to make sure that it is also nice and flat, that both strips are flat. Go ahead and grab a fabric marker and a ruler and mark a line from the top corner down to the bottom corner. Again, on one side of this marked line should be the 2 loose ends, and on the other side should be the 2 ends attached to your quilt. This is important that the seam is in the right spot. Once you have marked that line, you will just go ahead and sew right along that line. Do not put it this way. Put it so that the 2 loose ends are on one side and the 2 ends meeting your quilt are on the other. This is the thing that I used to mess up all the time. Once you have sewn along that line, this is what it should look like. And before cutting away those loose ends, let's go ahead and lay your quilt flat and make sure that everything looks how you want it to look. The 2 ends should not be pulling on the quilt at all. It shouldn't be too tight, but it also shouldn't be too loose where you can like fold up the binding and it's not flat against the quilt. If it is, just go ahead and rip out the stitches and try again. Mine is looking okay, so I'm going to go ahead and trim this back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure you're trimming away the loose ends and not on the other side of your seam. And then I give it a little press and finish sewing on this binding by just sewing a 1/4 inch away from the edge like I did the rest of my binding. And then we will be ready to flip it over and attach it on the other side. When you're ready for this step, your binding should be attached on all 4 sides, and I like to take an iron and press it out and away so that it kind of opens up the seam here. So I just take my iron and press the binding away from the quilt around the entire edge. Now it is time to flip it over and fold our binding over and hold it in place so we can stitch it on. Clips are a very popular option here where you would just fold it over and clip it in place. I love using glue basting, so that's what I'm going to show you. And basting is just the process of temporarily holding something in place before stitching it. So just know I'm not holding my quilt together with the glue. This is just to hold it there so that when we take it to our machine, it is in the right spot. I just use school glue. It's Elmer's, it's washable. Put a thin line right along where I want to fold over my binding and then fold it over, press it with my iron. This quickly dries the glue to hold the binding in place. And I will show my corner here. I kind of do it this way and make sure that the binding is folded over the stitch line from where you stitched it on the front. By making sure I'm covering up that stitch line, I know that when I stitch it onto the front, it will catch the back. Then to finish my mitered corner here, I put a little bit of glue on top of that end of the binding and then bring my glue all the way down and just keep doing the same thing, pressing it down with my iron to make it dry fast. And this will hold my binding in place so nicely when it is time to go stitch it on. We are almost done here. Now, I like to stitch from the front. You could do from the back too. Again, just figure out what works for you. And I like to either stitch slightly onto the binding or right in the ditch, which would be where that seam is on the front. Since I covered up that previous stitch line on the back, I know that I'm going to be catching the back of the binding because it should be in that spot. Make sure your bobbin is full before you start because you're going to want to make it around the entire perimeter of your quilt. And here you can kind of see I am catching the binding on the back. And just go around the entire quilt and get that binding stitched on and you will be all done. That's it. I really need to learn how to hand stitch on my binding. I promise I'm going to do it sometime this year and I will share at that time.